Hey, hey, hey you. I know you can hear me.
Hey, now that I got your attention, I'm here to tell you about the room that you're locked in, so listen carefully. You're currently locked in one of the most polarizing horror games of all time, and I'm going to help you break free by telling you everything you need to know about Silent Hill 4: The Room. If you ask any Silent Hill fan to rate the games in the series, you're generally going to be met with the same response. The original 3 games are the best, Homecoming is the worst, PT's cancellation is the biggest travesty in all of gaming, and Western Silent Hills just don't hit like the originals. But there is one game the community will never fully agree on, and that is Silent Hill 4: The Room. This game was made in tandem with Silent Hill 3, with Team Silent splitting the resources between the two titles. While Silent Hill 3 felt like a natural continuation of the first 2 games, Silent Hill 4 was so divorced from the original trilogy that people originally thought that it was never meant to be a Silent Hill game to begin with. This rumor was further spread due to an old interview with a misinterpretation from the team that made it sound like Konami slapped the Silent Hill branding on it to sell more units. When I first read this interview, I thought the same thing too, even citing the interview's transcript in one of my videos about Silent Hill 2's loop theory. If you've ever heard this myth and still believe it, I don't blame you, especially after playing the game. An interview with Akira Yamaoka and Masashi Tsuboyama, the game's sound director and chief producer respectively, that took place before the game's launch shed some light on the philosophy of the game series moving forward. Tsuboyama would acknowledge that combat in games is generally the fun part of video games as a whole, with hints that future Silent Hill games may not even be in the horror genre necessarily. Between this and talks that Silent Hill 3 was originally planned to be a freaking rail shooter, it was inevitable that the series would eventually split off from its roots. Tsuboyama expressed that the use of the room was one way to add some new flavor to the series, with the concept of using the room like this one as a one-time ordeal. It's pretty clear that the folks working among Team Silent were creatives that wanted to explore new ideas with each installment, making this rapid evolution in design one that was always destined to happen. This is further shown with an interview post-Silent Hill 4, hinting that Silent Hill 5 was playing with the light and dark mechanic that would never come to fruition. You can say that Silent Hill 1 and 3 had a similar narrative, acting like a duology, but the themes and tone across the first 3 games were so uniquely coded with a similar mechanical framework. If the idea of a rail shooter for the 3rd installment wasn't enough, the original story was also scrapped due to the dark concepts being too much to get past the ratings board. With a deadline for the 3rd game coming up and 2 scrapped ideas, it's likely that the version that we got with a connection to the first game and similar gameplay was in fact the result of a rushed product. After scrapping the rail shooter and the original narrative, who knows what would have been cooked up for the 3rd installment if they had another year or so to figure things out. And hey, if that happened, the 3rd installment may have been the black sheep that we would have been talking about instead of the room. Then I wouldn't have had to come all the way down to Ashfield to tell you about all this. Hypotheticals aside though, the overwhelming number of changes coming from the 4th installment naturally split the fanbase for years to come. For those who loved the original trilogy wished that every title moving forward could have at least kept that iconic framework, while others saw a need for change like Team Silent did. Now that we have a general idea that Silent Hill 4 turned out very different from the original 3 games, it's important to look at what those changes were and how they affected the title. Instead of exploring Silent Hill, our protagonist, Henry Townsend, that guy over there who's your roommate, is trapped in his apartment in a town called Ashfield, not far from Silent Hill. This apartment room replaces the town at the game's central hub, with a mysterious hole appearing in the bathroom that brings you to various locations that act as the game's dungeons. So instead of running through the town of Silent Hill to reach your next area, you instead stroll down the hall, go to the bathroom, then go through this hole to get there. This can make the experience feel quite linear by comparison, with the option of free roaming the town giving the first 3 games an open world feel before open world games were really a thing. Not only that, but you heard me right, the game doesn't even take place in the town that the series is named after aside from one location. Also, the game is in first person while in the hub world, but we'll touch on that later. As mentioned earlier, action is more prevalent with a wide variety of melee options, with many of them being breakable after a short while. Couple that with some dodge mechanic that feel like a janky Souls title, and it's evident that they wanted to incentivize more melee combat. This is further substantiated by the lack of firearms, those being the handgun and revolver that instead replace the handgun, shotgun, and rifle progression. What makes this all the more confusing, however, is the inclusion of apparitions that cannot be killed in combat, making about half the enemy encounters ones you have to run from. You can impale them into the ground with a Sword of Obedience, but given that there's only 5 of these swords in the entire game, it's pretty impractical to rely on these outside of a few corner cases. The confusion continues with Silent Hill 4 only having 2 boss fights throughout the entire game, far less than any other title when this is supposed to be the game with the most action. But one thing they did do to spice up the fights is making the inventory management take place in real time. No more pausing the game to reload, heal, change weapons, or use key items. Instead, you've got to use the D-pad and action button like you would in a game like Kingdom Hearts in order to use any items. All 4 titles still use a camera that follows behind you and changes to a fixed position or a cinematic angle that follows you in certain areas. The main difference, however, is that the first 3 games use tank controls for movement, while the 4th installment uses a free moving control scheme. Had Silent Hill 4 given the option between the 2, I don't think this would even be worth bringing up, but this change in controls makes a huge impact on the experience. With more games using free movement with the analog sticks, Team Silent adapted this type of movement to give better mobility when fighting versus the stiff, limited movement that you get with tank controls. Had the fixed and moving cameras been replaced with a strict third-person perspective, this would have worked with the game's control scheme. The issue, however, is the creative camera work that the series is known for plays a massive part in the game's atmosphere, but actually works against the game's free movement controls. One moment, you're holding the left stick up to move forward, then the camera starts panning outward, which forces you to trace the camera's movement just to run in a straight line. Mix that in with unkillable ghosts blocking the way on a narrow pathway, and you're gonna have a bad time. I get the game's combat is balanced around being able to make quick turns to maneuver, but having the option for old school tank controls would have gone a long way. Puzzles in horror games fill out the non-combat aspects, with Silent Hill being no exception. With Silent Hill 4 trying to be more action-based, the game's pacing can't be hampered down by abstract puzzles isolated to a single room. So instead of translating a poem about birds in a sequence of piano keys, we get a simpler, find item in one area, then use that item in another. It's not to say that the original trilogy didn't do something like this too, but previously, this had a higher degree of complexity, such as combining seemingly unrelated items to accomplish something. The room does make up for this by having some key items being restored in the apartment, like cleaning something in your sink to make it usable, but it doesn't go quite as far as some of the other titles. While scenarios are still abstract in nature, the solutions tend to be more rooted in logic. For example, this guy who has a key item that we need is thirsty, so we head back home, grab some chocolate milk from the fridge, and trade the chocolate milk to the guy for the key item.
Oh man, that was awesome. Here, take this.
The radio, flashlight, and fog are all minor details that collectively shape Silent Hill's identity. The 4th title, however, drops all 3 of these from the game's DNA. Despite how small of a change these appear to be, these 3 things were iconic to the franchise that helped drive tension and horror. It's not that the room wasn't scary at times, but it made the atmosphere feel more akin to a generic horror game rather than being part of a greater legacy. The last notable change I want to mention is the inclusion of a limited inventory space with a storage box in your apartment. The idea is making preparation and planning a component of the game between visits to the hub world and the other world, similar to how you would in Resident Evil safe rooms. Not only that, but it helped manage sifting through your inventory in real time, so that way you're not scrolling through 20 golf clubs trying to find one healing item as dogs are biting at your heels. I'm okay with the idea of limited inventory space, but when every 10 bullets takes up a single slot, plus melee weapons, key items, health items, swords, candles, and equipment for an NPC that you're escorting, don't worry, we'll cover that later, those 10 slots fill up really fast. This can result in multiple trips back to the room to make space, only to fill them back up with these damn golf clubs you can't discard. I know I've mostly refrained from directly inserting my opinion thus far, but this single change messed up the pacing of the game to an annoying degree. When I say that managing Chris's 6 inventory slots in Resident Evil 1 is significantly easier than managing Henry's 10, there's a fundamental problem with the design. Now that we've established the immediate changes implemented in Silent Hill 4, we need to examine its cast of characters. We meet our protagonist, Henry Townsend, a regular guy who's trapped in his apartment for the past few days. I'm sure you'd know since you're stuck in there with him. It doesn't take long to realize that his personality is drier than a microwave raisin, and his tone is somehow flatter than Maria's from Silent Hill 2 Remake.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
Yeah, my name's Henry.
It baffles me that this guy is so devoid of, well, anything. Silent Hill 1 gets memed on for bad voice acting, but considering it's the first game with a very low budget, it's pretty excusable.
It was foretold by gyromancy.
Not only that, but the character of Harry at least reacted to things happening around him with a stoic motive of saving his daughter. That aside, I don't think I even need to say much about Silent Hill 2 and 3, as those are arguably some of the best performances in gaming at the time.
It doesn't matter who I am. I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real.
Silent Hill 3 may have been rushed, but they did one hell of a job writing Heather's character, as well as pairing a fantastic English voice actor for the part.
I don't know any more than you do. All I know is that things are getting really screwy around here, and I got a weird feeling it's got something to do with me. Maybe you're just an innocent bystander, but I can't feel sorry for you because you dragged me into this.
But for some reason, they couldn't have done this with the fourth title? For a series that's become known for rich characters and personal stories about the protagonist, I kind of felt blindsided by the time I reached the end. Pushing through the game, I kept thinking, this Henry guy's gotta have some crazy backstory that ties everything together. But then that just never happens. Instead, the main antagonist, Walter Sullivan, steals the spotlight in every aspect. And yes, it's that Walter Sullivan from the newspaper and Silent Hill 2. While Silent Hill 1 and 3 had the cult members Dahlia and Claudia as the main antagonists respectively, these characters were only part of a greater picture that was occurring. Walter, on the other hand, is the antagonist and is quite literally the sole reason for everything happening in Silent Hill 4, so blame him for being locked in here. We'll get more into his backstory and motives later on, but I find it important to note how much of the game is solely centered around Walter, with your opinions on the game's overall story being heavily correlated to what you think about him directly. At the very least, Walter's character is seen positively in the eyes of the Silent Hill community, and by positive, I mean this guy is absolutely deranged in the best way possible. The remaining cast consists of your neighbor Eileen, the superintendent Frank, aka James Sunderland's dad, and a variety of individuals that Henry crosses paths with for each section beyond your apartment. These supporting cast members can range from being okay to forgettable to almost comical for all the wrong reasons, with the exception of Eileen. Eileen feels like the most grounded character who reacts to the events happening more appropriately than Henry ever would. Despite being a better written character with a decent voice actor, she pales in comparison to the likes of anyone from Silent Hill 2 or 3. But considering the high bar for those previous titles, it's pretty fair to say that Eileen is at least an above average character for the time. Moving on to the topic of combat is where points of contention start to arise. As mentioned earlier, Silent Hill 4 had the idea of heavier combat in mind while trying to maintain tension as a horror title. Melee attacks are pretty similar to previous titles. Ready your weapon and swing, or hold the attack button to charge your attack for a bigger hit with a longer recovery time. When locked onto an enemy, Henry can do a quick sidestep to dodge and maneuver. On its face, melee combat plays like a bad Legend of Zelda game or Souls-like game in terms of controls. The dodge mechanic simply replaces the blocking mechanic that was added in Silent Hill 3, as in theory, it provides the same utility of nullifying an incoming attack with a well-timed button press. One-on-one encounters are pretty easy since you can stun lock an enemy in place using quick weak attacks to easily pull this off, but don't expect this to happen too often. Most of the time, you'll be fighting enemies in packs, but it's still not too difficult to separate one from the group and fight it solo. It should be noted that like most survival horror games, just running past the enemies tends to be the better option since most enemies can be outrun. But whether you choose to engage or not isn't really a big deal for the first half of the game, since you can just return to the apartment and restore your health. You can stockpile resources by using melee weapons only to clear out killable enemies, then top off your health by going back to the apartment instead of using health items. With that in mind, using bullets and health items feels like a complete waste during this period, because, well, it kind of is. I'll talk in more detail about the game's overall flow later on, but for now, I need to circle back to something specific that was mentioned. When I said killable enemies, that infers the existence of unkillable enemies. As early as the first area, ghosts are present that are immortal, but the game doesn't tell you this in a direct manner. So if you missed a certain note at the very beginning, or you just didn't take it literally, the player is left to discover this the hard way. I distinctly remember wailing on a ghost over and over before coming to the realization that since these are ghosts, they can't be killed by normal means because they're already dead. The ghost can be quite annoying, only being taken care of permanently if you impale them with the rare sword of obedience. Most of the time, these ghosts are in packs, making the use of a sword nearly pointless for the vast majority of cases. And worst of all, they don't even need to make contact to hurt you. Just being in the vicinity slowly drains your health. Not enough to be a serious threat, mind you, but enough to make you panic while fumbling around an area. This was evident in the first area, where there's 3 trains that you have to get through that acts like a maze while ghosts are slowly draining your health. If the intent was to enact panic in what would normally be a simple maze, they technically succeeded. But at what cost? My frustration? This statement can honestly sum up a good amount of creative decisions that Team Silent made during the game's development, but we'll address those as they come. The list of unique melee weapons that exist is quite lengthy, but outside of an invisible slider, weak but quick, and slow but heavy hitting, they don't exactly feel very distinct from one another. I found myself using this one-handed axe for the majority of my playthrough, since it got the job done with stun locking enemies in place using quick jabs. A good number of weapons like golf clubs are breakable after a few good swings, but with the limited inventory system and not noticing a significant difference in damage, they just went straight to the storage box without getting used. The use of firearms is significantly reduced with what feels like less ammo relative to the enemy count compared to previous titles, coupled with only the handgun and revolver as options for the first playthrough. Considering the amount of enemies that appear at a time with how little damage the handgun actually does, it's really only useful if you're willing to use multiple magazines on a single group of enemies blocking your path. The revolver plays a similar role, albeit more effective. There is an additional bullet type for the handgun that can quickly knock down a ghost, but given that this takes up an additional inventory slot, this mechanic was largely ignored by me. Not only that, but these bullets are extremely rare with only 3 of them in the entire game. Because of this very specific use case, I only found myself going out of my way to use this a single time, downing a very specific ghost that's required to progress. I don't mind the game having all these different corner case type weapons and items, but having too many of them in conjunction with a very limited inventory system, these mechanics start to clash. And that's not even mentioning amulets, candles, and weapons for Eileen that take up an additional inventory slot as well. I think the clunkiness of combat can be narrowed down to having too many ideas from different individuals shoved in without enough time to refine them in a way that works. On paper, all these ideas individually sound great for a survival horror game to change up what Silent Hill perceived as a stale system after the first 3 installments, but having too much change was simply too much for my liking. There are defenders of some of these changes that I don't like, but I think in general, the sentiment is that Team Silent was a little bit too ambitious without enough time. Okay, at this point, I know what you're thinking. I must hate the room. But I actually like the inside of your apartment. I can't go inside, so I'll talk you through the grand tour from out here. To your left, this fine open kitchen with a refrigerator packed with a carton of chocolate milk. Behind you, a wide living room with a painting from James's dad, a glowing notepad that Henry stares into for some reason, and a nice view of the town. Broken TV, a radio that talks to you about zoo animals, a storage box, and a hole behind your furniture? What are you looking at? By the entrance, a fine washer and dryer. You must be ballin' to afford these amenities. Down the hall and to the left is Henry's room with a haunted phone. And lastly, this messed up bathroom with a big ass hole in the wall. I hope it's to your liking, because you're going to see a lot of this during a playthrough. For the first half of the game, the apartment is pretty static throughout, with new notes being slipped underneath the door to help narrate the events of the past when key events are triggered. The change from third person in the other world to first person perspective can be a little bit jarring at first, but in a good way. That actually might be the first time anyone's described jarring as a positive experience, but that's oddly something special about Silent Hill 4 that it nails. Movement feels a bit slow as you do a general sweep throughout the area on any return. And speaking of movement, be sure to change the controls to the alternative settings for the apartment. By default, both movement and looking around are mapped to the left stick, with the alternative control setting being what every first-person game has been using for the last 20 years or so for controllers. Whenever you return here, a part of you feels like you can just swap some items, restore some health, save your game, and then jump right back into what feels like classic Silent Hill. But this strange aura lingers here. It's also important to note that the opening sequence of this game is a nightmare sequence where these nasty looking apparitions overtake Henry before he wakes up. That initial seed is planted that you're in danger, even in the one area that video games designate as a safe place. I remember early in my playthrough I heard what I thought was someone's footsteps behind me, only to realize it was just the sound of Eileen sweeping the halls outside of my door. All it took was a short intro to instill that paranoia to a degree so early on, making the hub world feel like it was just as threatening as the other world. Aside from acting like a safe room in Resident Evil, the room gives the player clues to piece together the full story as you monitor the outside world using whatever openings you have. Seeing people talk outside your door, seeing what Eileen's doing, who for some reason has that creepy rabbit from Silent Hill 3, reading billboards, and just seeing the environment around you. From time to time, you can listen to the radio, documenting events like the activities at the zoo, or just the news playing that one of your neighbors died. As the game's first half plays out, the initial paranoia starts to fizzle as the pattern of return, store some items, read some notes underneath your door, save, and return to the other world feels like you're truly in a safe room. After some key story events, the room starts to resemble something that looks like the opening sequence. The sink starts running red, the ceiling fan collapses, slippers with bloody footprints. All the while, your walls start to act like a living organism. You are no longer safe here. The ghosts from the other world are forcing their way in through the walls, causing sustained damage in your vicinity. Even areas like your storage box can get haunted if you accept a doll from Walter. Waking up in bed from the other world doesn't fare much better, since you can start taking damage immediately upon returning from this freaky dude. The room's hauntings drastically shift how you need to play the game during the back half, with the biggest change being that you are no longer able to heal inside your apartment. The game spent the first 3 to 5 hours of your time conditioning the player to see your apartment as being safe, only to yank that out from underneath you at the drop of a hat. Horror games have been known for separating rooms that have storage and save points away from any form of damage, usually for practical reasons. Silent Hill 4 says, fuck that, you're in danger from the moment your file finishes loading. As annoying as this may sound like from a pure gameplay perspective, health drains pretty slowly, so unless you're already on the verge of death, the scare factor and uniqueness supersedes the potential inconvenience. White candles can be found throughout the game that allows you to exorcise the spirits from a given area, making it safe again for the time being. If you don't have any of these white candles and you just need to get around without taking damage, there are amulets that you can equip to act as protection both in and out of the room, but they will break over time when exposed to danger. White candles are best used in areas around key locations to minimize the effects to your health, but if all important areas are already cleansed, it's worth using these candles on less frequently visited areas. One reason for this is that one of the two factors that determines your ending is directly tied to how haunted your room is when the credits roll, with the room's cleansing being the objectively more important one. But before we start talking about endings, we need to talk about where our story begins. And even before talking about that, the opening sequence is the most unsettling of any Silent Hill game thus far. Previous installments had openings with artistic yet horrifying imagery, accompanied by a melodic and somber track. The presentation often looked like an early 2000s CGI music video in the best way possible, while the room's opening felt a little bit more hopeless. This is conveyed through the erratic camera movements and grainy film look, emphasized by the heavy and grim atmosphere that carries over into the main game. Disorganized footage is sprawled out across the screen, with the music being overtaken by the sounds of what's being shown. A chaotic mess of clips, with sounds cutting in and out that's beyond unsettling. Artistic cuts and camera movements give the player a taste of what's in store for them, an experience like no other Silent Hill before it. The sounds are loud yet silent, setting in the distilled feeling of pure discomfort. Nearing the end of the opening, tension shifts, juxtaposed by a more somber and emotional track. The picture is now clear as the music fills the landscape with what feels like sadness and regret, flooding our emotions. Various cuts get weaved back in before the music abruptly stops, letting us know that there is no moment to catch your breath in this game. Those few seconds of silence are deafening before a more peaceful track lulls us back into a sense of safety, all before the title reads, Silent Hill 4, The Room. Okay, now let's talk about the story. Henry Townsend has been living in room 302 at an apartment complex in Ashfield not far from Silent Hill for the past few years. Everything was normal up until 5 days ago, when the front door had locked him in with a reoccurring nightmare of ghosts coming in to kill him in a blood-filled distorted version of his apartment. Upon waking up, it's noted that the phone line does not work, the first hint that trying to contact someone in the outside world is a fool's errand. After the failed attempt, an incoming call comes through from an unknown woman saying,
Help me.
What?
It's also at this point that Henry sees that the phone line has been cut, further solidifying the supernatural presence within room 302. Furthermore, seeing the front door chained up is quite menacing, with the message written on it saying, Don't go outside. Walter. Looking through the peephole, we see our neighbor Eileen, completely oblivious to the circumstances with 15 bloody handprints on the wall across from us. Keep that number in the back of your head, it will be important later. A letter is underneath the door that reads, Mom, why doesn't you wake up? The writing is likely from a child due to the bad grammar, insinuating his mother's death before he's even able to comprehend what that is. A note by the window mentions another world where those who die remain a spirit for eternity. If only I knew I had to take that literally. Otherwise, I wouldn't have spent so much time wailing on this poor spirit for as long as I did before realizing that I couldn't kill it. In the bathroom, Henry finds a mysterious hole in the wall that wasn't there before, and decides to crawl through it since there doesn't seem to be anything else he can do. Of course, this isn't before picking up the iconic steel pipe. Good call there, Henry. Crawling through the hole has an eerie filter like the one that we saw in the game's intro, foreshadowing that the world that we're entering is an unsettling one before reaching a bright light at the end. Also, this entire sequence is supposed to look like a birth canal. If I don't say that here, I know that someone in the comments is going to say something. Henry finds himself on an escalator leading down into the subway where he meets a woman named Cynthia who thinks that she's in a dream. Prior to entering the hole, if you looked out your window, you can see her entering the subway outside of your apartment. Cynthia's demeanor appears to be a bit back and forth, with her outwardly saying that this must be a dream, also offering Henry a special favor if he helps her find the exit.
I'm kinda scared all alone. I'll do a special favor for you later. It's just a dream, so I might as well have some fun.
Throughout our time with her, the idea of everything being a dream continues to come off as a coping mechanism to rationalize what's been happening, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Not far in, she runs into the bathroom to puke before our first enemies appear. These grotesque green creatures with long tongues called the sniffer dog that scream using the stock audio file. For a game that has some of the most talented sound designers in horror history, it's really baffling to me that an unedited stock sound was used for the game's most common enemies. At least it still sounds better than Henry's line deliveries.
Your dream.
After the encounter, Cynthia is nowhere to be found, but what can be found is this nasty looking organ thing coming from the walls. In one of the bathrooms, a hole similar to Henry's is found, leading him to wake up in his bed. He wonders if he was in Cynthia's dream like she said, but even Henry thinks this is just stupid. Back in the living room, a cabinet seems to be out of place, and when moved aside, reveals a hole in the wall with a message carved into a different part of the wall. Oh, and for some reason, there's just a handgun chilling there underneath the furniture. Don't know what that's about. Is it yours? Don't worry, I won't tell Frank if it is. The message on the wall conveys that someone before us used to be in the same predicament, trying to tunnel their way out through this hole. The issue being is that even though we can clearly see Eileen's room, we physically cannot go through it, as well as Eileen not being able to see or hear us. The message suggests that we're in another dimension, sounding pretty similar to the article that we read earlier. We now have a solid basis to assume that breaking free from this room through physical means is nearly impossible, and we may not even be in the same plane of existence compared to everything else that we can observe outside of the room. The phone starts ringing in our bedroom again, with Cynthia on the other line asking us to come and save her, and that she has a token for us if we need it. Back in the hole we go, and I just crapped my pants. No, seriously. I was kind of zoned out for a moment waiting for the sequence to end when I had a mini heart attack after seeing this pop up on screen.
Bruh.
The coin that the statue is holding can be used to enter the innermost parts of the subway, where Henry can run into Ghost for the first time before rescuing Cynthia, who's locked inside the subway car. It doesn't take long, however, before Cynthia gets separated from us yet again because, I don't know, plot reasons? Running around the subway, beating dogs, and looking at these weird organ things, we hear Cynthia telling us to come meet her at the turnstile. I don't know how she got there so quickly, but once we get there, Henry sees a dying Cynthia with the numbers 16121 carved into her chest. As she bleeds out, Henry consoles her by reaffirming that this is all just a dream in an attempt to put her at ease. For someone that's barely had any screen time, this scene was surprisingly emotional. Henry wakes up in his room again to hear the sounds of an ambulance outside. The paramedics are heard talking about the incident outside, confirming that Cynthia was found with the number 16121 carved into her body. Another note is found underneath the door referring to a cult, the same cult from Silent Hill 1 and 3 that were called the Order. This establishes that the events of the previous games do in fact have a connection to Silent Hill 4. Revisiting the hole in the bathroom, Henry notes that the hole is getting bigger before crawling right back in. This time, however, Henry finds himself in the woods near Silent Hill, the closest thing to actually being in the town that the game is named after. We find a car with a note from a guy named Jasper, searching for the devil in Silent Hill. We soon find that guy Jasper giving a small exhibition dump about how the cult used the orphans in this area, as well as tying in some general lore about the Native American practices to speak to the dead. Continuing to explore the area, Henry sees a little kid who runs off after Jasper starts spouting about the third revelation. whatever that is.
Finally, the third revelation. Something's gonna happen.
Jasper also has something that we need to enter the orphanage, so we head back to the apartment to get that chocolate milk that we mentioned earlier. Good thing you weren't a shitty roommate and didn't drink it earlier, otherwise we'd be screwed. While back in the apartment, we see Eileen trying to check up on it through the peephole with some other unknown neighbor. This helps establish that none of the other residents know anything about Henry except his name and face. Even by the end of the game, that still holds true to the player. I mean, you even live with this guy and you barely know anything about him. The part that's interesting, however, isn't what's being said, but noticing behind them there's a 16th bloody handprint instead of 15. Upon returning to the woods, we give Jasper the chocolate milk, who gives us a hand shovel in return by disrespectively throwing it onto the ground. I swear, this guy's gotta be autistic or something. The shovel has a riddle on it that points us to dig around this weird looking hand tree that gives us a key to get into the orphanage. After digging up the key, we read a message inscribed onto it, saying that the holder of this key will wander for eternity. When we try to go back to the orphanage, a fog and grainy filter starts to build up before realizing that Henry is stuck in a constant loop. To bypass this curse, we simply need to go back to the room, drop off the key into the storage chest, go back into the woods, re-enter the room from where the orphanage is, get the key from the chest, then go back into the hole where we're spawned next to the orphanage where we can use it. These little thought exercises using the room to get around obstacles is well implemented in my opinion that replaces the many puzzles of old. It's a fresh enough take to use for most of the game in different ways, but had more games used a similar gimmick, it would quickly lose its appeal. Going into the Wish House orphanage, the place looks trashed and abandoned. Inside, there's a passage about the cult scripture that can be found, as well as a note asking whether or not they found Alessa yet, as well as asking about Walter's progress. At this point, there's very little about Walter being mentioned outside of a message on your door from him saying not to go outside. This note helps construct a timeline of events that relates back to Silent Hill 1 when Alessa split her spirit from her body to create Cheryl, the child that Harry Mason would find and adopt and go searching for in the first game. This means that before the events of the first game, Walter was still a child in the orphanage in Silent Hill. There's another note on one of the walls with a list of rules saying not to go outside, similar to the message that you see on your front door. Henry is currently being isolated within his apartment, just how Walter was with the other children at Wish House. Venturing further in, we find Jasper screaming in agony while he's on fire and carving the numbers 17121 into his own chest. Despite dying a painful death though, Jasper's obsession superseded the pain as he rejoiced that he was able to meet the devil. There's no other details on why he's like this, but I should note that there's no other character aside from maybe Walter himself that behaves like this. Waking up in bed yet again, a radio broadcast detailed Jasper's death and rules it as a homicide. The most important part about this report, however, is not about Jasper himself, but how the numbers carved into him connects back to the Walter Sullivan case from 10 years ago. Hearing the doorbell, Frank Sunderland is trying to unlock it to check on us after Eileen made a report. Unable to open up the door, he mentions how it sounds like something that's happened before. This is all the while a 17th bloody handprint can be seen across from us. Before continuing to the next area, you may have caught on to the game's gameplay loop. Wake up, look around the apartment, crawl into a hole, explore a new area, watch someone get murdered, then repeat. Each cycle adds a new handprint outside the door, and each death uptakes the second digit carved into the victim. Throughout these endeavors, information about the current situation as well as the events of the past are sprinkled in throughout, using notes with the majority of the game's revelations coming at the midway point of the game as well as the last segment. Admittedly, the pacing does suffer a bit as the gameplay itself can be pretty unengaging at this point, with the mystery of the game's narrative being the driving force to keep you going. You can make the case that other games in the series thus far holds the same sentiment, but I think it hits a little bit different here. While other games did have primary areas like the hospital, the narrative didn't adhere to a typical type of formula. In past titles, key events can be behind any door, making the experience feel more like a movie where every moment feels important. This is in contrast to The Room, which feels more like a TV series where the beginning and end of a season hold significantly more weight than the fluff that's in the middle. For this analogy, Silent Hill 4 is basically a 2-season TV series, with the intro being episode 1, the subway with Cynthia being episode 2, Jasper in the Woods episode 3, with the major shift in game design being at the start of the second season that's somehow simultaneously better and worse than the first season. Returning to the bathroom, the hole is yet again grown in size, with the sound of a child from the other end. This time, Henry finds himself lying on the floor of a nasty-looking prison, hearing the screams of a man from afar to be released from his cell because Walter's coming to kill him. A few notes nearby gives the player a clear objective. one of them from an escapee and the other from a guard, hinting that an obscured area on the first floor is the target with some hoops to jump through to get to it. It can be concluded that these prison cells were for children, with the reference to corpse chutes really driving home the point that there's a lot of unsavory activities occurring here. The prison's layout is a giant circle. Prison cells are in the center, with spiral staircases both on the inside and out to maneuver across different floors. After entering the prison, there's another note slipped underneath the door whenever the player takes the inevitable break back to the room that starts to ramp up the narrative. The message is written by whoever lived here before you, and is likely the same individual that tried to dig the hole in Eileen's wall. It's evident that someone was trapped in this room just like you were 3 years ago, since the Walter Sullivan case is 10 years ago as of the current game state, with this person citing it taking place 7 years ago. This guy's own investigation into the case showed that there's 10 victims who were killed within 10 days, with the numbers 01121, 02121, 03121, all the way up to 10121 carved into them, just like the other people that we've seen die so far. Alongside the numbers was also carved the name Walter Sullivan. So what does all of this mean? Basically, 10 years ago, Walter killed 10 people with a counter on each of the victims before getting caught. Now he's doing the same thing, but started at 16121, implying that there were 5 other victims between now and then that are unaccounted for in the narrative thus far. Also, if you haven't picked up on it yet, it appears that the first 2 digits of the 5-digit number are the ones that are actually counting the victims. As far as the 121 at the tail end of the number, that hasn't been explained yet, but we'll get to it eventually. Exploring the prison is dreadful and depressing to say the least, with messages in the cells talking about being watched from the center, and a rumor that the meat in the cafeteria is from other dead kids. Reaching the center of the watchrooms, the guards left notes explaining how you can line up the holes in the floor to some of the cells to make a direct path to the kitchen. Other details show how messed up things really were here, with bodies of the dead being thrown down to keep the other kids from seeing, as well as using fear to keep them in line. One of the guards even seems to take pleasure in watching the kids get locked up with no access to food or sanitation as they slowly deteriorate. It's also a little bit eerie that the passcode to get into the kitchen that one of the notes claims is an interrogation room is also 302, the number on your apartment. After freeing the man who was locked up, we see him pleading with the child who he claims is Walter Sullivan. We learn that his name is Andrew DeSalvo, as he claims that he used to watch the kids in the orphanage. But considering his panic, I would assume he's one of the guards who actually tortured the kids here. Andrew tells us that the orphanage was a front for the religious cult called the Order, with Walter finding a connection with the scriptures on the descent of the Holy Mother before wandering off in fear.
That kid Walter, he was really into that mumbo jumbo. Especially that descent of the Holy Mother business. It was scary. Oh God. Oh.
After fiddling with the water system, rotating some cell rooms, and turning on the power, we're able to make our way into the interrogation room where we find, guess who? Andrew! And guess what? He's dead, with the numbers 18121 carved into him. Huh, never would have guessed that I'd find that here. Henry soon gets ejected from the other world, with a new note underneath the door explaining the mechanics of the Sword of Obedience. Once again, we look out the peephole to see an 18th bloody handprint. Frank and Eileen are outside talking about how there's something wrong with this apartment. Creepy Frank mentions how there's a lot of creepy things in this world, then randomly starts talking about an old umbilical cord that he keeps in his room that's starting to smell bad. Okay, I think the creepiest thing about this apartment is your lack of social awareness, Frank. No wonder your son's so awkward.
It's okay. Anyway, she's dead.
Before leaving, Frank leaves a note underneath the door that's covered in blood, making it unreadable for the time being. Heading to the bathroom, the tub is bloodied with the sound of screaming coming in faintly from the hole to the other world. Crawling into another new world for the 4th time, Henry wakes up in a back alley before we witness a man falling from a rooftop on what must be the softest concrete parking lot in existence. This guy is screaming as he falls like he's about to die before landing with a simple ouch.
Ouch! Damn it. Where the hell am I?
His name is Richard Braintree, the guy that we saw talking with Eileen a while back, so he knows that Henry's been missing. At first, it seems like Richard has some common sense, making the connection that something is wrong with the apartment since you both ended up in the other world, as well as connecting it back to the guy who lived in room 302 before us. The only real info on the previous resident that we got though is that he was a journalist that started losing his mind before locking himself in his room. Considering what we know, the previous occupant was indeed locked away in room 302 just like we are now. Richard then walks off on his own for some reason while dismissing our warning about the kid that Andrew referred to as Walter Sullivan.
Watch out for that kid.
Entering one of the nearby buildings, Henry finds a ghost impaled onto the floor with one of the 5 sort of obediences, where taking it frees the ghost, making it a threat yet again. During our visit back to the apartment, a knock can be heard at the door where an ominous message in blood can be seen on the wall where the handprints are, simply reading, "Better check on your neighbor." Whether this is in reference to Richard or Eileen, I'm not sure, but when checking the hole in the wall, Eileen is nowhere to be found. Even creepier than that is when we check the peephole again, the message is just gone. Back in the building world, Richard runs into little Walter and tries to get some answers out of him before recognizing that he's the kid that used to wander around the apartment before Walter runs off.
Hey, you! Stop!
After finding a door that resembled the outside of room 207, the room that Richard lives in, well, you already know what's coming. Richard is found with the number 19121 carved into his forehead while being shocked to death in an electric chair, all the while little Walter's pointing out the window. As Richard is getting fried, he tries to tell Henry that this is not a kid, but is in fact the killer that we know as Walter Sullivan. Waking up yet again, we look out our window into room 207 to see a man pointing at room 303, which is Eileen's room. Is that where Walter was pointing at in the other world? The radio was broadcasting Richard's death with confusion about the case of Walter Sullivan ending 10 years ago, even noting that they had Walter's corpse with the general explanation about this being a copycat. Checking up on Eileen, she's still safe at the moment, but of course, there's a 19th bloody handprint outside the room. Suffice it to say, the current story pattern is about to be disrupted as we enter the season 1 finale. Diving back into the bathroom wall, Henry wakes up in his apartment complex outside of his room, except the walls are made out of flesh and the floor a grated fence. We see a man knocking on the door to room 303, which is Eileen's room, before he walks away. Taking control of Henry, little Walter is seen knocking on room 302, crying out for his mother before disappearing as we approach. Walking down the hall, the bodies of sniffers can be seen laying lifeless in the same direction that the man went, showing that he's more than capable in a fight. The man can be found sitting on the steps leading to the lower floors, offering a doll that he received from Eileen when they were children. The man sounds sad, remembering how happy Eileen looked as a child with her mother.
She looked so happy, holding her mother's hand. Here. I'll give it to you.
While the game hasn't explicitly told the player yet, it's pretty easy to deduce that this man is Walter Sullivan as an adult. Between his child version and adult self, the implications of abuse at the orphanage and abandonment from his parents, Walter's character starts to form a sympathetic antagonist. That is, until you remember that he's a literal serial killer and a cultist, but the juxtaposition between the monster that we know Walter is currently and the innocent child version creates a strange paradox. That child version that we see no longer exists, but is a stark reminder that even the most vile monsters in society aren't born that way. They're created by the heartless people that allow the abuse to occur. But, back to the doll. If you pick it up, it doesn't do anything except haunt your storage box later, so it's best to just leave it and move on. Venturing through the Otherworld's apartment has a look and feel of previous Silent Hill titles, which is quite welcoming compared to previous locations. Returning to the room, another note is found underneath the door from the journalist with the revelation of what the numbers carved into Walter's victims mean. The 5 numbers are actually 2 separate 2-digit numbers, with the one in the middle being a slash, meaning that the victims that we've seen thus far are 16 out of 21, 17 out of 21, 18 out of 21, and 19 out of 21. This coincides with the 19 bloody handprints outside of the room, but it also gives a clear picture of what Walter's goals are up until now, which is to get to 21 victims. With only 2 left, the player can easily conclude that the last 2 victims that Walter is targeting is Henry and Eileen. Back in the Otherworld's apartments, some of the other residents' rooms are unlocked to explore, with the neighbor in room 301 being quite the unhinged degenerate. This is further shown as this guy named Mike has an unrequited love for the nurse named Rachel living in room 106, going as far to stuffing her mailbox with love letters. On a side note, this nurse named Rachel is also the same nurse that cared for Mary in Silent Hill 2. With Silent Hill 2 being so isolated from the main series, it felt like Team Silent was using Silent Hill 4 to further tie the existing game together for whatever reason. An article written by Joe Subscriber can be found outlining how the Wish House Orphanage is about a charity that was rounding up kids to brainwash them for their religious cult. This is also the same Joe Subscriber that wrote an article about the prison section earlier that can be found in the hospital in Silent Hill 3. A diary entry from Mike confirms that Joseph is the journalist who was in fact the one leaving the notes and lived in room 302 before Henry moved in. The only other info about Joseph here is that he gave Mike this rare porno magazine and would bring more if he came across one. Heading downstairs to the superintendent's room, we gain entrance using the key from room 301. We take a look at Frank's diary and find out that 30 years ago, a couple that stayed in room 302 just upped and left one day, leaving a newborn baby behind with him keeping the umbilical cord for some reason. Years later, a kid would start showing up at the apartment, likely the same kid that was abandoned in room 302. And honestly, at this point, we can just safely conclude that this is Walter Sullivan. We find some more bloodied notes that we can't read and slip them underneath the door to room 302 that we can look at in the apartment. When we go back to read them, one of the notes discusses how the police found a victim with the numbers 12121, indicating victim 12, but this was long after Walter took his own life in prison. The other note simply refers to Eileen's house key missing, which tells the player that unlocking room 303 in the apartment's otherworld is the objective. Heading back into the otherworld with the apartment key that we just found in the superintendent's room allows Henry to freely search all the locked doors throughout the apartment. This gives us some more insight on the individual residents that occupy the complex. Different rooms range from a collector of music, a gun fanatic, to an artist painting all the residents. But the one thing that is consistent is that a lot of these people are not right in the head. Room 101 has a diary complaining about a cat next door, and when you head next door to room 102, there's a dead cat in the fridge. I don't think I need to spell out what happened here. Along with the dead cat is another bloody note that we can slip underneath our door that mentions losing a key next to the bed in room 302. Lo and behold, there's now a key laying next to our bed that goes to room 303. But we'll deal with that after exploring the rest of the apartment. Room 106 houses the nurse Rachel, whose landline has her lover's number on speed dial, but when you dial it, it spawns a pissed off ghost. Besides an annoying phone ringing everywhere you go, this doesn't really do anything productive, but it does tell a little bit more of a side story of the other residents. You'll eventually find out that the phone ringing is coming from room 202, as the ringing stops when you answer the phone. The individual who lives here is a collector of paintings that he does, depicting most of the residents with a specific description to each of them. Rachel's been described as his beautiful darling, who's been bothered by a stalker. Mike from room 301, who's accurately painted as a porn fanatic. Richard from room 207 is said to have been a dick to some little kid wandering around, most likely Walter Sullivan as a kid, as well as confronting Mike on his weird behavior with an audio recording from a recluse from room 205. Luckily for us, we actually get a hold of this tape and we can listen to it on the radio back at home. Take a listen.
How do you like that, you sick little freak? You had it coming to you. These clothes are disgusting. Get them out of my sight.
I know. It'll be perfect to wrap his body in.
Hold it.
You!
Hold it, I think
You snooping around again?
Myself.
Get your ass out of here before you really piss me off!
Hold it. Hold it. I think I'll keep that one for myself. Hold it. I think I'll keep that one for myself.
Richard's room doesn't have anything of interest outside of the revolver that we see him using before his death. The apartment world is definitely the most interesting place thus far, telling multiple intertwining stories with subtle clues and passages that lets the player's imagination fill in the gaps of how dysfunctional this entire apartment complex used to be. In fact, this form of indirect narration from multiple accounts is present throughout the entire game, and is one of Silent Hill 4's greatest strengths as far as storytelling goes. It's a clever way of having a diverse roster of characters in a horror game without needing to see or hear from them, and it gives this location outside of Silent Hill its own unique presence. Not only that, but with how messed up the residents are as well as Walter himself, the believability of distorted worlds outside of Silent Hill becomes more palatable. But with that being said, it's time to enter Eileen's room. Upon entering, we see Eileen face down on the floor with the numbers 20121 carved into her back. She isn't dead though, as she looks up at young Walter, even thanking him. But why? At this point, we're not sure. She asked if he's found his mom before telling Walter to leave because it's too dangerous before collapsing. The music cuts out before a somber track starts playing as Henry falls to his knees with the weight of failure. Waking up yet again, the sound of ambulances can be heard outside. Checking the bloody handprints, there's still only 19 of them. So, is she still alive? Looking out the window, it appears that Eileen is being rushed to the hospital where she might be able to make it. Another red note shows up stating that Joseph sealed off the back of the storage room, afraid of Walter's power. A talisman can be found underneath the door as well. Checking the hole to Eileen's room, we can hear the cops saying that Eileen is alive, but isn't going to make it. They continue discussing the string of murders known as the Walter Sullivan case round 3, with round 2 still never being fully resolved, as well as there being nothing at the crime scene besides Eileen bleeding out with the numbers carved into her. So as expected, there was another group of victims when Joseph was alive here 3 years ago, and didn't resume up until recently. I guess it's time to use the hole in the bathroom again. Oh. Well, I guess that hole's closed up now. So now what? Well, Joseph did say that he closed up the back of the storage room, and upon looking further, there's something that resembles a devil on the wall. Using the talisman that came with the note, the wall changed to a message with 4 square inserts. The message is stating that Walter performed the ritual of the Holy Assumption, creating the otherworld that we've experienced thus far. The 4 inserts can be filled with tablets that we collected in the other worlds thus far, which opens a perfectly new hole. Considering Joseph's knowledge on the occult from his research, it's likely that this hole was here from the beginning and that he went on a similar journey, but had to seal it back up to ward off Walter. Considering the hole in the bathroom didn't open until after 5 days for Henry, it's likely that the energy from the otherworld broke through, with it being sealed back up now that it appears Henry is the last victim. Entering this hole, Henry finds himself in an operating room where Walter is messing with the organs of a mannequin. With blood on his face, he motions towards Henry before booking it out of there. The hospital is pretty straightforward, infested with possessed wheelchairs and burping patients. I know these sound like monsters from a parody movie, but no, this is in fact what it sounds like fighting them. The layout is really just an awkward looking hallway with plenty of surrounding rooms that eventually leads to a regular long hallway with 20 doors. After randomly looking through various rooms, Henry finds Eileen looking pretty roughed up, but we do find out that little Walter was trying to protect her from Big Walter. At first, I thought Eileen survived because of plot reasons, but having established that Walter once knew Eileen when they were kids, as well as being shown kindness through the doll, the game further shows a separation between who Walter once was versus who he became. It's even possible that when Walter first knocked on Eileen's door, he walked away because a part of him still felt a connection to her. Seeing how everyone treated Walter throughout his life, Eileen may have been the only person to ever see Walter as another human being. Leaving the doll behind at the stairs could have symbolized Walter severing his last ties to his own humanity that he had left as an adult. With Eileen starting to calm down, Henry tries to explain what's been happening, telling her that they need to go back to the hole. The rest of the rooms in the long hallway range from oddities like the spiked ceiling that nearly crushes Henry, some nasty looking beds, plenty of resources, dead bodies, umbilical cords, and most famously, the giant Eileen head whose eyes follow you, but we'll circle back to that in due time. Before continuing the story, however, we need to address an elephant in the room. Now with Eileen accompanying Henry from here on out, we've now transitioned to the back half of the game where everything you've known up until this point gameplay-wise has completely turned on its head. For starters, we're now escorting someone who, worst of all, is extremely injured, but at least you can give her her purse back to use as a weapon among other things.
That's my purse! I don't know you!
While Eileen can't die, she does limp around, can't climb ladders, and needs to be within a certain proximity of Henry in order to enter the next room with him. That's right, in a game where you sometimes need to run through tight alleyways with unkillable ghosts blocking your way, you have to stand idly by the door that you want to enter, waiting for this crippled woman, limping her way through while you're both getting attacked by enemies that you can't kill. This will lead you to reaching a door, then entering and re-entering over and over until Eileen is just close enough for her to spawn into the next room with you. What makes this even worse is that Eileen can get possessed, making her stop in place and start chanting some weird shit. You can help her by using a white candle, but those are better used in your apartment to get rid of spirits when you head back. Oh, did I forget to mention that your apartment's haunted now? I did bring this up earlier, but with your apartment being possessed, you'll now start taking damage in a haunted area, and you'll no longer be able to heal while you're back, but we can discuss that in more detail as time passes. Heading back into the room, we wake up without Eileen, only hearing the sound of something breaking before Henry notes that the air in the room feels heavy. Looking into the living room, that sound was actually your ceiling fan falling into your coffee table. Great. Awesome. I don't want to be in this fucking room anymore, I'm sure you don't want to be either. The newest note from Joseph has a key saying to go down into the deepest parts of Walter's world and to look for the ultimate truth. Some more notes can be found by the window, detailing victims 12 through 14 occurring sometime after Walter offed himself with a spoon to the neck, also noting that the hearts from the first 10 victims were all removed from their bodies and sewn back up. Kinda like what we saw Walter doing to that mannequin in the operating room. Upon returning to the hospital, Eileen is freaked out because from her perspective, Henry just kinda disappeared then reappeared sometime later without seeing any hole. Henry explained that Joseph was investigating the murders in Cult before disappearing, as well as a message to find the ultimate truth.
Yeah, he was doing an investigation about a religious cult and a man named Walter Sullivan. I got this letter from him. He told me to go down into the deepest part of him, and to look for the ultimate truth. Let's do that. There must be something down there.
Okay. I'll do it. You're the only chance I've got. I'll stick with you.
With no other options, that becomes the clear goal for the remainder of the game. After finding a long staircase through some weird interactions, a door with the Colt's insignia leads down a foggy path with a hole that can be used to go back to the room where we find a pair of slippers that are possessed and bleeding. Just what we needed. At the bottom of the spiral path, a door leads Henry back to a familiar place. The subway. That's right, the rest of the game involves us running through the same areas that we already did, but this time with Eileen. Obviously, there's other areas on the map with new puzzles to solve, but the biggest letdown is knowing that there's a lot more padded runtime for the next few worlds with minimal story progression just like the first half. Not only that, but the game is now a proper survival horror game, so I hope you stockpiled up on resources instead of wasting them now that we can't just regenerate our health. Your safe space is now a danger zone, and there's even more items than before to manage in your inventory on top of escorting some. Despite the story starting to ramp up, the overall game feels like it's starting to drag. Some speculate that using the same maps was shoehorned in due to a time crunch with more padding to extend the short runtime. While there's still a good amount of meat on the story, most of it could have been explained at any time. A proper climax could have occurred with only 1 or 2 more worlds to pace out the rest, but I do understand that a 5 to 6 hour long game in 2004 was just unacceptable at that point. Retracing our steps back to the turnstile on the subway, clumps of long black hair are scattered on the floor. Looking around the corner, the ghost of Cynthia arises, looking like Samara from The Ring. This is yet another pattern that we're going to see play out retreading the previous worlds. The victims of Walter become ghosts with features that separate them from the rest. You can ignore them, which I did at first, but they can be subdued with a sort of obedience. Aside from more enemies and a few changes from the first half of the game, the subway mainly just had new puzzles and areas to traverse after cleaning this dirty coin in the sink to use on a vending machine. While back in the apartment, a few more notes can be found underneath the door, with one explaining white candles and medallions, and the other noting a long-haired man would appear around room 302 after Walter's death in prison. Other environmental quests involved leaving Eileen behind since she can't use ladders. So, part of the puzzle is creating a path in order for her to reach the next area through a myriad of arbitrary tasks. I'm not saying this is a bad thing either. Having some time where you don't have to escort someone is always great, and running around solving puzzles in a creepy environment is a core pillar of the first 3 games of the franchise. Henry finds another staircase that leads down to a door with the Colt's insignia on it. This triggers a grainy scene with Walter raising a gun at us before going down another foggy pathway. So from here on out, instead of waking up in bed at the end of each section, we now physically walk down to the deeper parts of Walter's insane world. The woods with the Wish House Orphanage are up next, where the building is burnt to the ground where Jasper was incinerated. Among the rubble is a torso of a corpse, saying they'll open up a path when their body's made whole again. The map of the woods has the orphanage in the center, with 4 paths that branch off in linear directions. Each of the 4 paths has 1 body part each, with one of them containing 2. Bring them all back, and then the path will open to the next section. Simple, right? Well, kind of. You need to get a torch and light it with the holy flame to see down the 5 wells where the body parts are, but the flame will go out over time. Not only that, but there's plenty of enemies swarming the place, both mortal and immortal ones alike. Also, remember that scene at the end of the subway with Walter raising a gun? Yeah, now he starts appearing randomly, taking potshots at you. One moment, you're looking around an area that you've cleared out, only to get shot repeatedly from a distance while hearing him laugh. Luckily, the shots don't do too much damage, but it can be frustrating after a while. At first, his appearances were genuinely terrifying, but once you run into him a couple of times, the novelty wears off. And no, it's not just the woods where this is happening. Walter's now a stalker-type enemy for the remainder of the game. Henry comes across little Walter at Toluca Lake, where we start asking some basic questions. Walter acknowledges his name, but states that he doesn't actually have one, as well as never meeting his parents. Furthermore, he says that his mom is waiting for him where he was born, with people trying to stop him. But according to him, the scriptures say that he'll be with her soon.
I gotta hurry. Mom's waiting.
We're able to learn a little bit more about Walter, as there's some diary entries that his younger self left in a cryptic language on some trees and rocks that Eileen is able to read after studying archaeology in college. The entries talk about a ritual called the 21 Sacraments of the Descent of the Holy Mother, as well as some hints about why Walter thinks his mother is in room 302. Other entries confirm that Walter was in those prison cells where he was beaten and had to read plenty of religious scriptures. It's likely he was put there as a punishment because of him sneaking out to go to room 302 to find his mother.
October 5th. I got hit again. I didn't do anything wrong. I wish he was dead.
While wandering around, we also get to see Jasper, the not-so-friendly flaming ghost, who, just like Cynthia, we can just ignore. Nearing the end of the woods, a serious problem started to occur. There's some pretty long stretches that have a lot of ghosts attacking both Henry and Eileen, which, if you're by yourself, isn't really a big deal because you can just run around them. But since Eileen is limping the entire time, she's constantly under attack and getting more and more possessed, making progression increasingly difficult without using white candles to temporarily snap her out of it. It's also important to note that how possessed Eileen is by the end of the game affects the ending that you get, making the process of getting the best ending quite the frustrating challenge if you don't know what you're doing. While visiting the apartment during the woods, more areas start to become possessed, which is simply just another gameplay loop at this point. Once we have all the body parts reattached to the torso, the corpse starts to roll back in its wheelchair to uncover a hidden hole. It's likely there's some sort of ritualistic spell making the wheelchair unmovable, but I can't help but think that Henry could have just kicked this thing over and we would have been on our way. Below the orphanage is an altar with some torture weapons accompanied by the cult's Bible that outlines the 21 Sacraments from Walter's diary. The gathering of the white oil, the black cup, and the blood of the 10 sinners is required for the preparation of the holy ritual. The 10 sinners being Walter's first victims. Using these as an offering allows one to release themselves from their flesh and gain the power of heaven. This explains how Walter's death after the first 10 victims was simply him transcending beyond human form, which allowed the creation of the other worlds that we've been in, while also allowing him to be the 11th sacrifice. Next, it describes the 4 atonements wandering around in formless chaos, which is likely victims 12 through 15 where Joseph was trapped in his room prior to Henry. The final ritual says to separate the flesh from the Holy Reborn and the Receiver of Wisdom, which must be in reference to Eileen and Henry respectively as the last 2 before the completion of the 21 Sacraments. It is then that the Mother shall be reborn and the nation of sin shall be redeemed. Going down into the prison, we're met with Walter from the get-go, not in a cutscene, but with a gun pointed right at us. Running around the prison can be quite cumbersome, since the ladders that we normally use to go floor to floor can't be used by Eileen. This means that we need to walk all the way around the spirals instead, making backtracking quite the chore. On top of that, Walter randomly shows up, laughing and shooting at us while Eileen is trying to catch up and limping around helplessly. At a certain point, I kinda just stopped caring about Eileen and used the ladders. Then I'll just have to sit and wait for Eileen to run all the way around the walkway to avoid Walter from spawning. Going from the top floor to the bottom floor using the ladders, I'd usually have to wait at the bottom for about a full minute, checking the map on occasion to see Eileen running in circles all the way down to the bottom. On a trip back to the apartment, the front door, you know, the area where you're standing at, is possessed, with another note underneath the door. After cleansing the area, we pick up the note that summarizes Joseph's research so far. Walter was born in room 302, and was abandoned there as a baby before being taken to Wish House. At 6 years old, a cult member showed him where he was born, which made him think that room 302 itself was his mother. It was after that Walter would frequently sneak off to room 302 as a kid whenever he could. So, piecing together what we know, Walter is using the 21 Sacraments ritual to bring back his mother, which he thinks is this literal room. Doing this would infer that he's trying to make this room into a living organism, which would explain some of the weird organ-like happenings in the other world. That aside, the damn doll that Walter gave Henry is now possessing the item chest, making it completely inaccessible. Since we don't have a white candle on us, we have to go back to the other world and find one in order to cleanse it. This is also happening while we only have about a third of a health bar and no healing items in our current inventory. Luckily, the prison has about 3 candles that we can find to mitigate the issue. It's almost like Team Silent knew that people were going to have this problem where they couldn't get access to the resources. After moving the cell rooms around to get access to where we found Andrew's body last time, we find a shirt covered in blood and wash it off in the bathtub to reveal a message. The message tells us there's a sword hidden underneath one of the beds on the 2nd floor and that Andrew has the key to the basement. Overall, the message is basically just telling the player to get the sword, then use it on Andrew's ghost in order to get the key that allows us to progress. Once we pin him down using one of the special bullets designed for Ghost and then stab him with the sword, we grab the key from him and get to the last hallway of the prison that's guarded by 6 twin heads. I tried to run around them without fighting, but it wouldn't let me leave because Eileen was getting the crap beat out of her, so I guess we have to fight them. Back in the apartment world, Richard's ghost takes no time to make an appearance, dropping down from the roof like he did when we first ran into him. Similar to the second go-around in the woods, the world's exit is tied to 4 unassuming items scattered about that we need to put back in their respective places. When we go back to the apartment, we see bloody apparitions like the one from the beginning of the game growing out of the walls and blood running from the sink. Today's note also elaborates more on Walter's backstory, as he would go to room 302 every week, but would be harassed by the tenants that were constantly getting annoyed by him snooping around. Surprisingly, we would learn that Walter would eventually be in school and move out of the orphanage on his own, but would carry on his beliefs of the cult and hatred towards others, eventually starting the 21 Sacraments. Back in the other world, we're visited by our old friends Cynthia and Jasper, who we should have pinned down with the Sword of Obedience back in their respective worlds. Having them here created a lot of problems, trying to traverse key areas with Eileen trailing behind. Luckily, we get to bail Eileen for a bit when we encounter her greatest weakness yet again: ladders. While playing as Henry solo, we overhear the 2 Walters meeting for the first time, with little Walter being quite scared, but determined to see his mom. Big Walter states that it's time to complete the 21 Sacraments before carrying him away against his own will. This shows that even though these are 2 parts of the same person, they're not fully aligned with one another on their goals. After placing the 4 random items in their respective places, a clock starts ringing and opens up a door to the next apartment area. For a section of the game that has very little to add to the plot, the second go around of the apartments is definitely the most challenging and time-consuming part of the game. The overall map is expanded quite a bit from the first go around, and abstract puzzles will leave you confused and frustrated. For example, running into this pet store with Cynthia and company, changing camera angles and narrow pathways, it's difficult to thoroughly investigate the area. With that being said, you're supposed to figure out that you need to put the stuffed cat into a cage with only the vague journal entry to guide you. Even without the ghost beating the crap out of you and Eileen, it might still take you some time just walking around the room to figure this out. And that's assuming you found the cat before even coming here in the first place. Granted, the cue ball on the pool table, the volleyball in the basket of balls, and the birthday candles on the cake were at least somewhat intuitive. That doesn't change the fact, however, that these items and destinations are scattered about with the most complex map, making blind backtracking inevitable. Couple that with immortal enemies and a limping escort, and you're gonna have a bad time. At this point, I got so fed up with the backtracking that I dumped an entire magazine of handgun bullets when I found an item that I needed instead of running back to the apartment to make room in the storage box. After fighting our way through the end of the building world, we're stopped by the game's first boss. That's right, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that Silent Hill 4 has had no boss fights up until now. For a game that's supposed to be more action-driven, it's a strange choice to only include 2 bosses throughout the entire campaign, with both of them being near the end. This boss is called the One Truth, whose gimmick is to have a bunch of copies come down from the ceiling, but only one of them is the real one. The one that's real is always random, so you can't just memorize which one it is. If you hit the right one, you'll notice that all the creatures will recoil as if they've all been hit. It's as simple as finding the right one, then unloading everything you have into it. But of course, the issue is figuring out which one it is through a process of elimination. The fight itself is pretty luck-based and is quite frustrating due to the clunky lock-on system. After beating the boss, the victory feels pretty lackluster as the creature just retracts and the door unlocks. No cutscene or dramatic death in sight. On our way to the final world, a trip back to the apartment has a note with a list of 21 victims from the 21 Sacraments. Well, some at least. Names to note are victims 7 and 8, being Billy and Maureen Locane, both of whom were twins from the orphanage, 11 being Walter himself when he took his own life in prison, 15 being Joseph Scriber, 16 through 19 being the ones we've already witnessed dying, 20 is Mother Eileen Galvin, and 21, Wisdom Henry Townsend. The first bunch don't all have names attached to them, but are simply hearts needed for the first part of the ritual, with 11 through 21 having the handles of Assumption, Void, Darkness, Gloom, Despair, Temptation, Source, Watchfulness, Chaos, Mother, and Wisdom. The handles all have matching descriptors of the victim's personalities, with Cynthia being the tempter, Jasper's willingness to the cult, Andrew watching the kid's imprisonment, Richard's chaotic nature, Eileen being seen as a human mother figure due to her kindness, and Henry's wisdom being born from witnessing everything. Joseph Despair is from him giving up hope when he was trapped in room 302 prior to Henry. With that ominous note in hand, it's time to descend into the apartments. Walking down the spiral path for the last time, the door to the bottom is marked 302. Entering the room leaves a sinking feeling as we've entered another version of room 302, but now we get to see it from a third-person view. Seeing the perspective switch within the room is beyond unsettling, as the candles are glowing all throughout the apartment. Plenty of documents are lying around, so let's get to reading. First, a diary from Frank Sunderland claimed that he dreamt of a man with long hair, looking for his mother while crying and going into room 302 10 years ago. He brought tools with him and a bag dripping with blood before never being seen again. No one knows what happened that day, but noises from the vacant room can still be heard. Something happened in that room that night. A picture book can be found telling the story of a baby severed from his mother's cord before being taken to Wish House, who convinced him he can still wake his mother. That picture book is accompanied by the Crimson Tome, stating that this is not his mother that will be awoken from the ritual, but instead, the devil. The ritual was to give way to the realm of wickedness. Stopping the ritual would require bearing the mother's flesh into the one performing the ritual's true body, as well as using the 8 spears of void, darkness, gloom, despair, temptation, source, watchfulness, and chaos to make him mortal again. We'll circle back to this soon, as this cryptic message is the key to defeating Walter. Furthermore, the stakes have risen beyond our own lives. The completion of the 21 Sacraments could make Ashfield into another Silent Hill, with the resurrection of one of the cult's gods. The stories from Wish House were all lies, manipulating a child from birth in hopes that he would carry out their plans. Finally, some notes from Joseph before his demise, trying to break the wall, saying that when the bell rings, Eileen equals mother's body, blood, and that the flesh is in the super's room. As annoying as it is to do this much reading, this is a prelude foreshadowing the game's climax. Even after all that reading, we get a visit from Joseph himself, who will reiterate the current situation on a surface level for people who've been glossing over the reading. Despite the importance of the scene, the choice of line delivery from Joseph and the choice of music is perplexing and borderline comical, especially Joseph's last words on the matter. Either way, the message is clear to read the Crimson Tome for guidance. A pickaxe is embedded into the wall at the end of the hall that we can use in the same place in the real world to open up a hole. Once we break a hole in the wall and step through, a stench fills the air. Turning the corner, we're faced with a mangled-looking Walter Sullivan. Not the Walter that we've seen thus far, but his actual physical body that was dug up from Silent Hill, hung up on a cross with the numbers 11121 carved into his feet. In his pocket is the keys to our freedom. No longer are we a prisoner to this room. Seeing the lock snap out of place is both relieving and terrifying. The game-long objective is complete, but another has risen. We must kill Walter Sullivan. Stepping through the door beholds a gruesome sight. The apartments have been overtaken by the otherworld as Eileen limps from the dark hallway. Despite being free, it's like we never left. The building is swarming with nearly every enemy type in the game thus far, including a cameo from Cynthia, Richard, and Walter. Once you reach the first floor, the mood takes a sharp turn. The music changes to a soft and somber tone with the sound of little Walter crying out for his father that he's never met. Wandering through the rooms and halls, we hear the echoes of Walter's father, seeing his son as a nuisance and ready to abandon him. Depending on how possessed Eileen is at this point, one of 3 scenes will occur. She's either fully herself, partially possessed going in and out, or fully influenced by Walter at this point. Based on how we've played so far, you can take a guess at which one that was.
Daddy? Where are you? Where'd you go? Mommy? Mommy? Why won't you wake up? Henry? My head.
These moments before the final confrontation holds a heavy emotional weight, going back and forth of empathizing with Walter's inner child, but needing to kill the monster that he's become. In Frank's office, the umbilical cord that was mentioned before is retrieved. Just like the last scene, one of 3 scenarios plays out, similar to what happened in the apartment lobby. Across the 3 possibilities, one thing is consistent. Eileen is compelled to help little Walter, whether it be from possession or from her own volition before wandering off to the sound.
Mommy? Mommy?
Visualizations of Eileen, the monster, and Walter's own corpse starts to gather as the bell rings in the distance. With the umbilical cord in our possession, the pieces of the Crimson Tome are falling into place. We have the flesh of Walter's mother. Returning through the hole in the wall, Walter's body is already gone as expected, with an opening where he once was. A blood-soaked atmosphere overhangs us as if we're in someone's womb. Proceeding to the final room, we're confronted by Walter, as well as this abomination that Walter has become, screaming out. A spiked contraption is spinning in the center of the room in a pool of blood as we see Eileen staring off in a trance-like state. Young Walter is heard, begging to be let in as Eileen steps forward towards the spinning death trap. Walter intends to kill us here and now as the final victims of the 21 Sacraments. All the while, Eileen slowly marches to her own demise. The final confrontation is here. There is no turning back. Walter is completely invincible in his current state, being able to move at incredible speeds. To defeat him, we need to refer back to the Crimson Tome. First, we must bury part of the Conjurer's mother's flesh into the Conjurer's true body. This involves using the umbilical cord that Frank kept from Walter's birth on the monstrosity that Walter's body has become. This allows us to collect the 8 spears that were mentioned that are embedded into victims 12 through 19. The 8 spears must pierce the true body to make the Walter that is superhuman a mortal man again. Stabbing the true body with each pierce causes Walter to collapse to the ground, this being the first time any weakness from him has been seen. With all 8 spears piercing the monster, Walter now plays out like a normal boss fight. But unfortunately, there's one thing we're forgetting here. During the boss fight, Eileen is slowly moving to her certain death to be the 20th sacrifice. The speed of her movement is directly tied to how possessed she is at this point, which is extremely difficult to manage. Eileen getting hit, being too far away, being left alone for too long, all of these little things add up quickly and are outright hard to avoid. You can use white candles on her throughout the game to lower her possession level, but that's something I only did when I absolutely needed to because she was being completely overtaken, which halted progression. Because of this, Eileen was moving at Mach speed towards that death ball with her dying before I can even finish putting the spears into Walter's true body. Unfortunately, I was locked into her death being completely unavoidable unless I dug up an old save file from hours prior. Sorry Eileen, you're just gonna have to stay dead. The rest of the fight is just trading blows as the game stocks you up nicely before the final fight. After unloading whatever bullets I brought, the rest of the fight was just a scrappy mess, swinging the shovel around while attempting to dodge incoming attacks. There really isn't much more to say. I'm sure there's a very specific way you can get around this fight without getting hit, but like I said, the amount of healing items and ammo that I was able to bring into the fight didn't call for any strategy beyond just trading blows. Once the fight is finished, Walter's final words were calling out to his mother before dying in his own blood. Sadly, the same goes for little Walter as he falls to the ground, pleading for his mother to open the door to room 302. Now that the game's complete, we're met with one of 4 different endings: Escape, Mother, Eileen's Death, or 21 Sacraments. On screen is a visualization on how any of these endings are achieved, as they're tied to 2 requirements that the game checks for. First off, did Eileen die? Yes or no? Second, how haunted was your apartment before the end of the game? The threshold the game checks for is whether or not you cleanse more or less than 80% of the hauntings that have occurred. The escape ending is the definitive best ending for cleansing the apartment and saving Eileen. Henry walks out for the first time and visits Eileen in the hospital, where she says she'll need to find a new place to live. A very cut and dry happy ending. The Mother ending is similar to Escape, but you haven't cleansed your apartment. When visiting Eileen, she says she can go back to Ashfield Heights now. But that's not a good idea as the scene fades to room 302 being fully distorted just like the dream sequence. We'll circle back to the implications of this after discussing the worst ending. Eileen's death is as straightforward as it sounds. The apartment is cleansed and Henry is alive, but is distraught after waking up in his normal-looking apartment as the radio announces Eileen died in the hospital. The 21 Sacraments ending, where you fail to cleanse your room and fail to save Eileen, is quite different. For starters, we don't see little Walter dying at the steps of room 302 like we did the others. Instead, we see him cuddled up on a nasty-looking couch in a distorted version of the apartments, telling his mom that he'll be with her forever. The radio is broadcasting the recent victims like Eileen's death ending, except this time there's a lot more victims listed. Henry Townsend is reported to have died in room 302 as the camera pans to show the Walter that we just killed watching over little Walter. Furthermore, 5 more police officers as well as Frank Sunderland were found dead in the apartments, with the rest of the apartment complex residents being rushed to the hospital. We also get a little nugget about the beginnings of Silent Hill, as it's stated that what's happening now is what happened in Silent Hill many years ago. Simply put, Walter has won. The apartments are now like Silent Hill, and the cult's god is likely to rise from it. Circling back to the Mother ending, Eileen willingly wanting to go back to the apartment suggests that she's still under the influence of Walter. It's likely that when we go back home, the events of the 21 Sacraments ending may soon follow. I mean, I don't think any sane person would ever want to set foot in those apartments ever again after surviving that experience. But when you contrast that to the escape ending, she says, "Fuck that, I'm never going there again." Normally, Silent Hill has at least one bonus joke ending that can be unlocked with New Game Plus, but due to time constraints, that planned UFO ending had to get cut. It's unfortunate since the UFO gag has been in all 3 previous titles, with the UFO rounding up all the protagonists. We could have gotten a moment where Harry, James, and Heather all came down from a spaceship to abduct Henry. Instead, all we got in New Game Plus was a few extra weapons and this very impractical outfit for Eileen. The story of Silent Hill 4 somehow feels like a traditional Silent Hill game, as well as feeling very far from one at the same time. The setting taking place outside of the town is the obvious reason to point to, but aside from how the 3rd installment is a direct continuation of the first, Silent Hill 4 does a great job tying the whole series together. The setup of Walter's story in Silent Hill 2, as well as the murder of Billy and Maureen Locane, James's dad being the superintendent, mentions of Alessa disappearing, and more details about the cult's backstory that were the front-facing antagonists in 1 and 3 all contributed to making the 4 games feel connected. Walter's origin story and the story of Silent Hill 4 is simply a byproduct of the same cult long ago after being stopped multiple times. The main difference being that Walter isn't acting in the interest of the cult or its god, but is acting in his own self-interest with a ritual that uses human sacrifices instead of a vessel to birth the god. Our protagonist Henry is also the first to have literally no connection to what's happening outside of picking in the wrong place to move. You can make the case that Harry Mason also has nothing to do with the events of the first Silent Hill, but having raised Cheryl/Alessa for so long before the first game, he is very much emotionally tied to what's going on. The story is so heavily focused on the cult and Walter's ritual that it's easy to miss a lot of the symbolism that the game has. But even then, the symbolism lacks the emotional weight of the first 3 games. Instead of an emotional story through a disturbing lens, the room veers heavily into a disturbing category in both a visual and metaphorical manner. Although there's a lot of reading to fill in the gaps with the main story, things are pretty straightforward even if you don't read much of it. Most of the subtext of the game isn't that deep or profound, but instead constructs details and past events to make more sense of the what and why of the game's current events. For example, the enemies in Silent Hill games are manifestations of the person's psyche that makes the other world that you're in. Silent Hill 2 and 3 have monsters being manifested by the main character, with the first game's manifestations coming from Alessa, a victim of the cult with no ill intentions. Silent Hill 4 uses Walter's mind to shape the world and the enemies, making this the first time that we see an otherworld constructed by the antagonist instead of a troubled individual being tormented. Much like Silent Hill 1, most of the enemy's symbolism is opaque with surface-level meaning. Walter was apparently scared of dogs, so here's some ugly-looking dogs. He didn't like insects, so here's some insects. The Gumheads acting like primitive brutes were how Walter viewed other people outside of the cult, which is being stupid and aggressively violent. This view could play into Walter having narcissistic tendencies by seeing himself as more intelligent and superior to others. The only enemy type that appeared that interested me in terms of symbolism was the twin victims, those being victims 7 and 8, Billy and Maureen Locane from the orphanage. It's likely they manifested as their own creature to torment Walter, as he did grow up with them and may have had a kinship with the twins, just like the theory I had with the doll and Eileen. This may even show that Walter does in fact have some guilt towards some of his victims that he murdered that he actually had a connection with. But despite this red herring, you can contrast that with a short list of enemies from Silent Hill 2, where each enemy could have a full memoir written about them. Even to this day, details on the enemies of Silent Hill 2 and 3 are discussed and theorized down to the last little details, showing how in-depth both the enemy designs and individuals that manifested them were for their respective games. Analyzing Walter's upbringing as he's influenced by the cult may be the only piece of nuance and subjectivity, as the adult version of Walter is straightforward and one-dimensional with no chance of redemption. Contrast this with James Sunderland, and honestly any character from Silent Hill 2, and the lack of depth by comparison is hard to ignore. I honestly feel like dropping the number from the title and marking the game as a spin-off would have tempered expectations and may have even changed the way that fans viewed the game in the context of the franchise. But hey, that's just a theory. And speaking of theories, Silent Hill 4 feels like the most open and closed case of any Silent Hill game due to the heavy number of explanations for newer concepts, as well as the established lore from its predecessors. While I may feel this way, Silent Hill 4 still has a handful of theories, albeit less than the other 3 games. I'm not going to go into too much detail about them, as it would be its own separate discussion altogether, but here's a short list of some of the more popular ones. First, Henry's a tulpa, or a manifestation of Walter's, all for the purpose of being the 21st Sacrament. 2. The entire game is nothing more than a shared dream between all of the residents. 3. Silent Hill 2 and 4 takes place in a different dimension from Silent Hill 1 and 3. And lastly, there's a past connection between Henry and Walter that makes Henry the ideal candidate for the 21st sacrifice. Like most theories, the ones I've read through either had enough holes in them to not take too seriously, or there just wasn't enough evidence to support completely reframing the given narrative. This isn't a dog on anyone's theories, mind you. After all, the Silent Hill franchise is designed to be a playground for open interpretation, but for most of these, they're just too flimsy to hold up to any real scrutiny and consider canon in my opinion. I at least respect the fact that most people making these theories don't claim them as fact, unlike some hardcore theorists for Silent Hill 2. But the one area of discussion that rightfully gets the spotlight for theory crafting is the giant Eileen head in the hospital. The popular theory is that Henry feels guilt for looking into Eileen's room through the hole in the wall, so instead, it's being done right back at him. The issue with this is that the manifestations are from Walter and not Henry. So here's a quick theory of my own. Eileen is referred to as the mother in the 21 Sacraments, with Walter choosing her due to her previous kindness towards him. We also see organ-like manifestation through different parts of the other worlds built into the terrain, like these intestine in the subway and body interior in the apartments. Walter also views the room as his mother, but he must at least have some basic level of understanding that a physical room is just a space made of inanimate objects. Walter's subconscious is trying to reconcile the impractical nature of a room being what birthed him, and the belief that it is in fact his mother. The room and other worlds are inherently connected, and in some sense, they are one and the same. So, parts of a physical human are infused into the space within the other world despite being disjointed. Eileen's head is simply Walter putting his face to his mom, even if he knows that this is not actually his mother. It is instead the desire to be treated with kindness and seeing the way that Eileen made him feel as a child that coincided with her being the 20th sacrifice. I know this may not be the correct answer and holes can be poked into it, but it's the best I can come up with. I mean, for all we know, Team Silent just threw this in because it looked creepy and said, hey, fuck it, let the fan base decide what to do with it. Between the story, the atmosphere, unique mechanics, and even the theories all help propel the game above many other horror titles for most people. But the thing that drags it down almost unanimously is the gameplay in the other world. I feel like it's important to make that distinction because the first-person view and exploration of Room 302 is one of the better highlights of the title that technically falls under the category of gameplay, but it serves a very different purpose. The gripping tension of an ever-changing living space that confines you to a very intimate first-person perspective is the very thing that influenced Hideo Kojima to make one of the most terrifying experiences with Silent Hill's PT demo. After experiencing the room firsthand, the DNA is felt with it feeling like a prototype to what would likely become the scariest game to ever exist had it finished production. Hell, even as an incomplete teaser experience, it still managed to achieve that goal in the eyes of many. For that alone, it's important to realize why Team Silent wanted to make radical changes to the game in order to reach new heights, even if that meant the occasional miss, which, let's be honest, there were definitely a few that made it into this title. I mentioned earlier that making inventory selection occur in real time instead of using a pause menu was done to create more tension in combat. The problem being that this hogged up the D-pad on the controller for a function that was hardly used for its intended purpose. The majority of the time I used the same weapon for an entire encounter, and hardly needed to use a held item during a dangerous situation. Granted, the few times I did need to switch weapons or heal up during a fight forced me to lock in so I could have a smooth transition, but the overall usage of the mechanic was cumbersome to say the least. It's also now that I realize that having the option for tank controls over the free-moving camera was not viable with the D-pad being taken up for inventory selection. That and this item selection mechanic is likely why the inventory had to be constrained to a small selection, so that way everything can be visible on screen while avoiding scrolling through a bunch of useless items. Would the amount of item slots have been changed if they removed this mechanic? I don't know. But at the very least, I could see them including extra slots as the number of unique items needed increased. Also, why couldn't we at least have a pause menu that lets the player look at the item descriptions that they have on them? Maybe I'm just dumb, but I wasn't able to figure out how to read the item descriptions after picking them up without revisiting the item box. That aside, I don't think the live inventory system achieved what it intended to accomplish, and if anything, negatively impacted other aspects of the game. Like I said though, this didn't really affect combat for me. However, there were other factors that did have a negative impact on the battle system. The lack of firearms was a problem in my eyes, and between the two guns the game provides, they function too similarly aside from one having more firepower than the other. Other Silent Hill games had the handgun as a weak, mid-range weapon, the shotgun for close-up encounters, and the rifle for long-range, high-powered shots. It was also in the third game they included the submachine gun for crowd control. Even with a lot more melee weapons in Part 4, too many of them ran together without enough to separate them from one another. This led to encounters feeling like I had two simple options, range or melee. Enemy variety also felt lacking, not in quantity, but with quality. Aside from a few qualities that the unique ghost had, only a few of the enemies stuck out to me in terms of how you fight them. The dogs at least had a pattern of anticipating their launches to dodge and counterattack, but most others were reduced to simply hit, dodge, or stun lock until it goes down. In my opinion, Silent Hill 1 did it best, with each enemy having unique ways to approach in combat, with enemy attacks that can stun or hold you in place instead of doing damage for other enemies to attack you directly. It's funny to me how the first title on PS1 had a high degree of satisfactory combat over the fourth game that was touted to be the combat-centric one on far superior hardware. Furthermore, the erratic behavior of the flesh body that came out of the walls can create some unnecessary frustrating loops on the subway's long escalator sections. It can be unnecessarily challenging to get through this gauntlet completely unharmed, with knockdowns sending Henry further down the moving steps. This can cause Henry to get back up just as the escalator is realigning with the flesh body that may or may not be winding up to hit you again before the game can even give you a chance to react. Something similar to this can happen with you with the haunted wheelchairs in the hospital and apartments that move around erratically and can change Henry's position further away from where you're trying to go. When you throw in the rest of the unkillable threats impeding your progress, Walter randomly showing up and needlessly dragging around a half-dead woman, simply trying to make it from point A to point B can be quite the frustrating nightmare. Suffice it to say, combat and enemy encounters were the biggest low point in the game based on my experience. Had either the ghost or escorting a lane been removed from the game, I think the actual act of playing the game would have been a lot more positive. With how little fun I was having with the actual core game is the main reason it took months to actually complete it. When asking a Silent Hill fan about Silent Hill 4, one thing that is universally parroted is that this is one of the most disturbing games in the franchise. While I do agree with this take considering the implications of what happened to Walter as a child, the explicit religious dogma from the borderline satanic cult, and the gruesome imagery, we need to understand that disturbing does not always equal scary. Besides me mistaking broom sounds outside of the room as someone entering, and the mannequin holding the coins appearing, not a single moment in this game actually felt scary in the slightest. Was there tension? Yeah. Was there atmosphere? Definitely. But between the well-lit environments, less abstract narrative, and comical enemies, Silent Hill 4 failed to immerse me into the game in a way that could make me feel a sense of fear. Crawling around the darkness of Silent Hill with just the flashlight is simple yet surreal, letting the lack of vision in the first 3 games create the natural sense of dread. Of course, the obscured vision is bad for fluent combat, which is most likely why the darkness and fog were removed. While disturbing set pieces can be effective forms of horror, the context and presentation need to be accompanied by it. Beyond the visuals, tension that can enact fear is also triggered through audio, which is lacking in gameplay compared to the first 3 titles. Previously, the intense soundtracks that would play in certain environments would make areas with no threats feel even more terrifying than a room filled with ghosts in Silent Hill 4. Abstract audio cues that don't have a direct resolution also plants uncertainty into the player's mind that persists throughout. Even the radio that indicates where enemies are nearby can also heighten a player's fear before even seeing them on screen, which can also be used against the player later on when an over-reliance on the radio is turned against them by either acting up or having to be left behind. An example of this is in Silent Hill 1, where the radio stops working down in the sewers, and in Silent Hill 2 where you have to leave all your inventory behind, including the radio, to go into this elevator. I will say, in terms of how much this title scares you, your mileage may vary as this can be quite subjective. So now that I've talked your ear off about this game that your living space is about, I'm sure you're eager to get those locks off your door. But before that, I do need to give Silent Hill 4 an overall judgment score. I'll be rating different categories out of 10 and calculate a weighted average score to give the game. The story of Silent Hill 4 starts off strong, with an overall mystery of how and why you've been locked inside your apartment, as well as the impending threat foreshadowed by the opening dream sequence. The evolution into the supernatural murder mystery is effective if you go in completely oblivious to anything, but the culprit being Walter Sullivan is hardly concealed, so it's not much of a mystery. The pacing does suffer quite a bit though due to the formulaic nature of one world, one murder, but there is enough substance in between to keep the player's curiosity going. The overall cast of characters is serviceable enough to not be a detriment, with Eileen and Walter being the standouts to make up for Henry's dullness. If you look at the story in a vacuum without the Silent Hill name, it holds up really well as a story about a cult and a tormented, deranged individual who's indoctrinated since birth. Beyond that, it's quite the disturbing ghost story with black magic and sacrificial rituals. Once you start putting the story up against other previous titles, however, it starts to falter in terms of what player expectations are for the franchise. The symbolism is a bit two-dimensional, however, with everything pointing to the revelation that Walter thinks room 302 is his mother without much deeper substance. If you're into occult stories and murders, then this will be right up your alley. But for me, I'm giving Silent Hill 4's story 8 bloody handprints out of 10. Overall, still pretty good. Next, the combat. There really isn't much to say that hasn't already been said. To roll it up into one statement though, it's not fun to play. Despite it not being fun though, that's not to say that the game isn't worth playing, as there's a lot more it has to offer. But combat just isn't one of them. It just so happens that the worst part of the experience is when you have to engage in the game's core mechanics. I can at least acknowledge that the game's combat and controls do function as intended, but the lack of depth and frustration really hampers the experience. That and about half the encounters are either against invincible enemies where you just need to run, or are just tedious and annoying like the fungus that acts like a pointless roadblock, or the bugs that are just time consuming to kill. The first half of the game also trivializes any need to actually try in combat, all because you can just put yourself at full health again by going back to the apartment at any given time. And by the time you actually need to focus on combat, you're all of a sudden given an escort that you need to protect the entire time. Since the combat technically works, I can't really give it any lower than a 5, so 5 bloody handprints out of 10 it is. Innovation is yet another aspect of Silent Hill 4 that needs to be highlighted. This is getting its own dedicated category simply because the amount of experimentation at play. The room itself is executed extremely well as the pinnacle of what the entry does right. By conceptually taking what is expected to be a safe room in every game and flipping it on its head allows the tension of the game to extend throughout every single moment. The balance of how the threats interact with the room is just enough to enact some dread, but not enough to bleed into frustration as a game mechanic. The only issue with how the room's hauntings function is that by making it so mechanical for gameplay purposes, it does break the immersion after a short while. Seeing the sink turn on with running blood isn't seen as something scary anymore, but instead is seen as a drain on my inventory of white candles. Despite the fear factor being reduced from this, I still find it to be a net positive, giving the game its own identity. Beyond that is how the room assists with puzzles, such as using the phone to call a number on a billboard across the street to get a pin code. Moments like these give the room a purpose outside of just being a set piece for saving progress, managing items, and exhibition dumps. The implementation of the ghost in the otherworld is also a hit or miss depending on circumstances, but overall serves to intensify the game's atmosphere. The real-time inventory management and limited space may not have been the most unique thing, but it is a sour point in the soup of experiments made by Team Silent. Despite that last gripe though, experimentation gets 9 bloody handprints out of 10 with the room carrying this category. The music, simply put, gets 9.5 bloody handprints out of 10 because Akira Yamaoka doesn't miss. The only reason for the half-point deduction is the lack of music during gameplay that would have gone a long way in heightening the fear and tension over the goofy sound effects you get when fighting. I feel like I don't really need to say much about the music because you've been listening to it this entire time aside from maybe a few tracks. Next is the scare factor and atmosphere. These two items are being bucketed together because they're usually pretty interchangeable, but in this case, they actually impact the game pretty differently. Much like the praise for the room and disdain for the live inventory management underneath the innovation category, the overall atmosphere is well executed in both the room and Otherworld, but I don't find it very scary. The set pieces were quite disturbing to look at, and if I were in Henry's shoes throughout all of this, I'd be shitting my pants 10 times over. Let's just be upfront about that.
Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck?
The stage is appropriately set, but the inclusion of multiple gameplay mechanics fights against the game's ability to be scary. To explain what I mean, here's a short list of things in horror games that can elevate how scary it is without breaking the immersion that you're playing a video game. First, having a one-time event that has no consequences to the player, that happens fast enough to make the player react before they have time to process what happened. Silent Hill 2 pulls this off with a jump scare in the bathroom that happens as you're about to exit the room. It doesn't hurt you, and it's completely unexpected on a blind playthrough, and it only happens a single time. Silent Hill 4 tries something like this twice with the falling ceiling in the hospital and a similar trap in the forest. Both of these can't hurt you, but it doesn't quite hit that sense of fear. Second is having a one-time event similar to the first, but have some stakes to it like an enemy ambushing you, or an environmental threat. For this to be done right, either the threat from a gameplay perspective is minimal or fail to avoid frustration of death, or have an insane amount of leeway that if you died, you most likely deserved it for not paying attention. The end result is a scare on a blind playthrough with minimal consequences that keeps the player engaged. A classic example of this is when monsters burst through the windows in the first 3 Resident Evil games. The issue with Silent Hill 4 is the reliance on this type of scare being tied to the ghost in the otherworld, making you scramble to the next room or through the hauntings in your apartment. Both of these are effective the first time due to the unknown, but once they've occurred multiple times, it's reduced to nothing more than just another gameplay mechanic. Walter's presence as a stalker enemy can be scary at first, but shows up way too frequently. This creates an annoyance to the player as well as the haunted wheelchairs. If you ask me if Silent Hill 4 was a scary experience, I really have to say no. The fact of the matter is that a more action-based horror game like Resident Evil 4 actually gave me more fear and anxiety despite being a walking one-man army strapped to the T. If the atmosphere and scare factor were rated separately, I'd have to give it a 9 and 3 respectively. So let's meet in the middle here and give this category 6 bloody handprints out of 10. The maps. The map designs are another hit or miss depending on which world you're looking at, so let's go in order from worst to best. The Woods of Silent Hill is at the bottom of the list as a lazy X-shaped linear map with the point of interest being the center. Your time here will dissolve into which of these 4 straight lines do I need to go in. The hospital is the runner-up for the worst map, as it's just a lobby surrounded by single rooms, then one long hallway with 20 randomly placed rooms in it. The hospital mainly suffers from being so small, whereas in past games, it's considered one of the best reoccurring dungeons for each title, making it feel even worse by comparison. Next up is the prison, which is fine for what it is by including the most complex environmental puzzle in the game that at least justifies the repetitive nature of the circular structured floors. A bit of variation is given to the basement, but the map design suffers most on the second visit, simply because Eileen can't use these damn ladders that made getting around the first time a lifesaver. The subway world is where my sentiment on maps starts to turn around, as it's far from linear, but has frustrating unkillable enemies in areas you'd least want them to be. Overall, it's okay. The apartment world has a bit of an asterisk on it because structurally, it's quite basic. For this world specifically, that's fine because it needs to mirror an actual apartment layout, meaning the design needs to make sense. By allowing the player to venture into other residents' rooms, the simplicity of the map complements the passive storytelling through the details of each person's living space. Not only that, but the uniqueness of the different rooms gives enough variation and surprise that even if the layout of the rooms and a simple U-shaped hallway are generally the same, it's the contents within the rooms that matter. And finally, the building world. It is a bit lacking on the first go-around, but expanding to have multiple floors and different key items scattered about, making this one feel the most like a Silent Hill dungeon. The only complaint is like the subway, too many unkillable threats making exploration and backtracking a logistical nightmare to traverse an otherwise well-designed area. Overall, map layouts have some highs and lows, making me give this one 7.5 bloody handprints out of 10. And for our final category, puzzles. Most worlds on each visit would have at least one gimmick involving the collection of one item used somewhere else, sometimes with the assistance of the room. Most of these are pretty easy to figure out with some basic intuition unless you refuse to read or look around your apartment. The 2 exceptions I found were the prison puzzle with the holes that actually stimulated my brain and made me use it, and the 4 items in the building world being too abstract. Granted, none of these puzzles were completely brain dead, and overall contributed to the experience of the game in a positive manner, with the room being used as a utility area being the main bright spot. The primary disappointment though is the lack of depth in most cases when compared to puzzles from other survival horror games, which can mainly be compared to Resident Evil and previous Silent Hills. So for puzzles, 7 bloody handprints out of 10, and you can thank the room and prison puzzle for boosting that score. Now that we're done arbitrarily ranking different aspects of the game, let's assign weightings to each so we can get a final result. 35% weighting goes to the story, as it's honestly the most remembered part of any Silent Hill game. 30% will go to combat, since it is the most important mechanic of any game with a decent amount of it. Innovation at 10%, because it's at least important to either recognize or punish a new entry that deviates from the established formula. Music at 5% because it's a supportive role to any game. Fear and atmosphere at 10% because it's a horror game, and it's important for the overall experience but not a make or break. Map designs and puzzles are both at 5% each for being a supportive role to the game that doesn't quite make or break the experience, but the weightings are lower due to subjectivity. Throwing all that into a blender and we get 7 bloody handprints out of 10. Some things were great, others sucked, and some things were right in the middle, giving us a game that left me with mixed feelings all the way through. And truth be told, I went into this game knowing almost nothing about it, purposely avoiding anything online until I had experienced it myself in order to get the full, unfiltered, and unbiased view of the game that's divided this fanbase. The only things I knew about it going in was that you're stuck in a room in first person, you play in third person after you go into a hole, James's dad is a side character, and that a guy named Walter Sullivan is the main antagonist who was first referred to in a newspaper article in Silent Hill 2. I went in expecting Henry to have some insane baggage and backstory that tied to Walter Sullivan, and some kind of twist about Henry's past. Hell, I even thought this little kid was actually Henry before playing it, but as I made my way through the game, there was a slow realization that this game was not what I was expecting. I mean, I expected it to play out differently at least because of the room, but with how far this was compared to other Team Silent games, it was really hard not to feel disappointed. I mean, I went out of my way to buy a whole new console just to get the affordable version of this game because I wanted to play it so badly. I was optimistic that even if this wasn't going to be my new favorite, it would at least bump one of the original 3 games down to a 4th place position. Instead, it sits comfortably in last place of the Team Silent quadrilogy, and will likely be the only one of the 4 that I never will play again because I already struggled enough to bring myself to finish it to begin with. With only 8.5 hours of in-game time by the end, it took me over 2 months from the day I started the file to rolling credits, with each session being about one other world before I just wanted to play or do something else. Compare that with the first time I beat Silent Hill 2 in 2022. It took me less than 24 hours from starting the file to rolling credits, with the vast majority of it being in one sitting. And the only reason I had to stop was because it was 1 AM when I turned it off, and I immediately finished it the moment I woke up the next day. Playing Silent Hill 1 and 3 may have not been as extreme as 2, but a similar sentiment can be given to them. That comparison to the 4th game is simply how much of a gap in engagement I felt across these titles. Sadly, Silent Hill 4 just feels like wasted potential. The overall story and concepts are really good, but it's packaged together with gameplay that's even more frustrating than Rule of Rose at times that could easily have been avoided. Despite my complaints, I don't regret experiencing this game firsthand at least once, because the overall experience is something you just won't find with any other game to date. As much as I don't really like Silent Hill 2 Remake compared to the original, I actually think that the template that Blooper Team has would work best for Silent Hill 4. Mix in some element with PT into the room sections and you'll have a great horror game on your hands. I truly feel that the worst parts of this game had held it back from greatness, and could easily be fixed in hindsight with a story that holds up on its own. Well, now that I'm done rambling, I'm sure you're wondering how you're going to get out of this room. If you were paying attention, you just have to break that wall over there and get the keys from dead Walter's pockets. I mean seriously, you could have done this like 45 minutes ago. Were you even listening? Go on, go get the keys.